Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Makdisi Street podcast. My name is Sari Makdisi, and I'm joined by my brothers Osama and Kareem, as always. This is going to be a bonus edition for our Patreon subscribers. The first part of it will also be on our normal podcast channel, and the whole thing will also be available on our YouTube channel. We'd like to ask you, of course, we'd encourage you to subscribe to Patreon if you're able to. And if you're not, then at least if you can, to provide the show with 5-star rating on your podcast apps. Not for our own vanity, but rather in order to counter the pressures on the show from, let's say, a certain vantage point, which is trying to suppress the show. The ratings help make high ratings keep the show visible. Low ratings try to suppress it effectively. So if you appreciate what we're doing on this program, please give it a 5-star rating. And similarly on YouTube, thumbs up, like and subscribe as well. And thank you for that. So today's show, we're just going to have a discussion between the three of us, or among the three of us. And I'm going to turn it over to Kareem, who's managing the show for today.
Okay, thanks, Eddie. So yes, for today, we're just going to kind of discuss a few things that have been going on in and around the world of Palestine in its various ways. And just in the last 24 hours, I mean, I've noticed, guys, what do you think? I've noticed, I mean, yesterday we had another one of these kind of German meltdowns where they effectively kind of moved in to bar and to ban basically the kind of Congress, I think, in Berlin, dealing with Palestine. And two of our guests on this podcast, Ghassan and Salman Abu Sitta, both of them were involved in this, and both of them were shut down. And Ghassan himself was detained at the Berlin airport and basically kicked out soon after a few hours of detention there. And Salman Abu Sitta's video that he had been trying to record was also suppressed and not allowed to be broadcast. So Osama, I know you've been following this issue. What do you think about what's going on and this kind of increased German, which seems to be this descent into, I don't know, is it fascism? Is it repression? I'm not sure how to describe it.
No, I think you described it well, Karim. I think it is a question of it's first of all, it's first and foremost, it's racism. Second of all, it's fascism in the sense of suppressing and crushing any form of dissent. And third of all, it's this doubling down on a German sort of the extraordinary official German hypocrisy, the racism, the pretense of atoning for the sins of the Holocaust, which of course was perpetrated by the German Nazis at the ongoing expense of the Palestinian people. This has been German policy for decades, and it's and we see this, and it's not just the Germans, of course. The Germans are the most egregious in this regard officially, but I would say it's the entire sort of liberal West that carries on with this pretense of claiming and pretending to atone for the sins of the Holocaust and the sins of Western anti-Semitism by making the Palestinians pay the price of being the victims, the perpetual victims of a Jewish state that was created on their lands. And so we see this, they keep doubling down, in other words, and the banning of Salman Abu Sitta, the banning of Ghassan Abu Sitta, because of some
and
kind of
others
fear.
and others
And others, of course, and others.
and
It's been repressed. And the irony and the tragedy is that there are so many Arabs, Palestinians, Syrians, Lebanese, Iraqis, other people, Afghans, many people who've gone to Berlin and have found refuge in Berlin, and it was supposed to be a hub of artistic and academic freedom. And I know many friends who have been there, and of course I've been there several times. It's just absolutely, on the one hand, it's shocking and aggravating and upsetting, and on the other hand, utterly predictable, given the German official line, which is to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And that's where we are. And if my fear, of course, is that if the fanatical sort of Zionists have their way, that we would have a similar situation, in the U.S. Sadi, what do you think in that sense?
Well, we do almost. I mean, it's in the U.S. It's not quite as bad as in Germany. I mean, as you're saying, Osama, Germany, because of the Holocaust, Germany is basically trying to offload its guilt for the Holocaust and European anti-Semitism in general onto the shoulders of the Palestinians, and make the Palestinians pay the price for their own, that is for Germany's and Europe's own, historical crimes. But the U.S. is, yes, it's not as repressive as Germany. But if you look at the situation on many, for example, many college campuses across the U.S. I mean, look at Pomona College, which is, half an hour from where I am, or 45 minutes from where I am in LA. I don't know if you followed this in the news, but last week there was a student protest around divestment. There was a unanimous vote for divestment. And as has happened at many universities, including my own university, including our own, Osama, you too, at Berkeley, there was a student vote for divestment. And then, of course, when it gets to the administration, the administration just says, no, absolutely not. We refuse to countenance this kind of thing, and so forth. And so in the protest at Pomona, literally the head of the university called in riot police from neighboring police stations, neighboring cities around Pomona, and literally riot police attacked these students on campus, and 25 or over 20 of them anyway were arrested, and like similar to what happened with the infamous case of the Irvine 11 at Irvine, UC Irvine, 10 years ago or so, where again the university basically turned over students for public prosecution. I mean, it's sort of the upward. I mean, I think students and faculty are changing at all American universities, but the upper administrations are, relentless in their unreflexive, unthinking, unstinting, unblinking support for the Zionist project in Palestine. Look at Columbia University. Look at Penn. Look at all, basically up and down the East Coast. Not all of them, but in many cases. And they're like lesser versions of what's happening in Germany. In other words, this sort of repression has become it's prevalent across the West. It's most repressive in Germany for historical reasons, but it's also there in other places as well.
But this is the question I wanted to push and push back on and ask Karim, to bring Karim in, because he's obviously at an American university, but in Beirut as opposed to in the US. And the question is, in the German case, it seems to be much more about sort of, obviously it's a racist form of an immoral morality play that the Germans keep playing, which is to say that we atone for the Holocaust by sort of smashing and crushing any kind of expression of Palestinian sort of calls for self-determination and freedom, precisely because the Germans have put themselves in this ideological impossibility of basically saying, we support a Jewish state to make amends for the Holocaust, no matter if that state is going to be perpetually at the expense of the Palestinian people, who will never have full rights on their own land. In America, do you think it's you said it's full support? Do you think it's full support, or it's just more that in America and on the US campuses there is this generational divide that we all see? It's that the university administrations simply want to ghost the Palestinians. That's a term I saw on Twitter the other day. It's more about just pretending that nothing is happening, that we don't want to talk about this. We want to pretend that nothing is happening. And so, Karim, I was wondering if at AUB or in general, how does all this sort of this Western repression, this Western hypocrisy, the sheer nature of what we see, in other words, a genocide unfolding in Gaza, pogroms, you just mentioned, Karim, at the opening, this rampage in the West Bank, the killing of a U.S. aid worker. And so I'm wondering, Karim, like in Lebanon, in general, how does this extraordinary hypocrisy in the 21st century and the overt double standards, the West doesn't even pretend anymore to do anything, and the bombing of the Iranian embassy in Damascus, and the complete lack of response on the part of the U.S., except to say we're going to defend Israel. How does this all play out for you? How do you read it?
Well, I mean, you brought up a lot of things there. I think here it's the focus in Lebanon is, and I think we'll talk about it in a minute, because the focus is on what's going to happen next, on the question of the Iranian response, and therefore possibly Lebanese response, possibly Syrian response, possibly Iraqi response. So the whole response to the Israeli provocations, to the attack in the Iranian embassy in Syria, and the different attacks Israelis have been doing in order to try to draw, precisely to try to draw this Iranian attack in, and all the diplomacy that the Americans and others and the Arabs are trying to do in order to try to stifle that. This is the main concern here. It's not so much double standards. This kind of stuff is, I think we just don't even bother with thinking about too much here. It's kind of too obvious. But I just want to, before we get into that part, I want to get back to the Germany thing just to close it, because we have now producer Sina put on the quote by Ghassan Abu Sitta. I think it seems to have disappeared. But basically, to get back to the Germany thing, I want to push you guys a little bit more and say, because you talked about the question of atonement. And Osama, you've talked about it before, and Sadi, you mentioned the question of guilt. But I'm just looking up here that before I was trying to remember what it was. Yes, and so Angela Merkel herself in 2008, when she addressed the Knesset, talked about the idea that Israel's security and existence was Germany's raison d'être. And then Olaf Scholz, the
Raison d'état,
raison
raison
d'être.
d'état.
And so, I'm trying to translate from German here. And Olaf Scholz has now said it several times since October 7th. He's come out and said exactly the same thing. So that the very notion of German security and German and I mean Israeli security and Israeli existence is the very reason of. I mean, it just is something that's more than atonement. Surely there's something beyond, which helps to explain this hysterical response.
Yes, because it's not. I mean, it's a play of atonement. It's not look. If you go to Germany, you've been to Germany, Kerim. And all of us have been to Germany. There is an extraordinary and honestly an incredibly powerful memorial culture. You go around Germany, you see how seriously they have gone through, and of course they were compelled to do so, to actually sort of confront the Nazi crimes and the Holocaust and the enormity of what they did as Germans in World War II, before World War II, in terms of the anti-Semitism, the persecution of Jews, the persecution of Gypsies, the persecution of Roma people. In other words, all these other peoples that the extraordinary evils of that period. So they have confronted that, and one has to say it's something incredibly, at one level, moving. But as you say, it's all premised and predicated on pretending that Israel's creation and the idea of a Jewish state is not going to come perpetually at the expense of the indigenous non-Jewish majority, the Muslim and Christian majority of the population of Palestine, who were expelled in 1948 and who today remain stateless and second-class citizens or under military occupation or being subjected to genocide. And that extraordinary, so is that guilt? I don't know if that's guilt anymore, Karim. I honestly don't know what it is. I think it's racism as much as a discourse of guilt, and it's all premised on the invisibilization of the Palestinians. Remove the Palestinians from the picture, pretend they don't exist, pretend that they have no, that they don't play a part in this equation, and you can go on with this kind of charade of claiming to feel guilty about the past by not seeing what's happening on the ground today. I mean, that's what I find astonishing, really, honestly. So I don't know, Sadi, I don't know. Guilt is because the idea of saying that Germans, I don't know, I'm not German. We should ask some Germans, I suppose. But, irrespective, the idea of saying we feel guilty, but somebody else is going to pay the price. And by the way, the last thing I'll say on this, Karim, is that in 1938, George Antonius, the great historian in the Arab Awakening, and I teach this, and I always talk about this in my lectures. In 1938, George Antonius wrote The Arab Awakening. And the very last pages of that book, and I urge all our listeners and viewers to read that book. You can find it on the internet. The very last pages, Antonius says in 1938, so before the Holocaust, but obviously after the rise of the Nazis, he says explicitly, what's happened to the Jews in Europe is outrageous and unacceptable. I'm paraphrasing. But he also says, you cannot solve European anti-Semitism at the expense of the Palestinians. That is morally outrageous. And he said this in 1938, and it's the same story all the way till now. Nothing has changed. It's gotten worse, in fact, because the Palestinians now are being subjected to genocide in Gaza, pogroms in the West Bank, second-class citizenship in Israel itself, and it's actually incredible. Sadi, what do you think?
I mean, I think what you say, it's interesting what you said, because of course Germany does, at least officially, have a culture of atonement and memorial is right, and as they should, because of what they did. Memorialization of the victims of the Holocaust, and what's that train station near where you were staying that has all these memorials, and there should be in the museum,
and they're very moving,
and they're
very powerful.
And no, they're very powerful, and that's all right. So you would think in a way that they have, it's not just that they've offloaded the guilt for the Holocaust onto the Palestinians, but because they have also acknowledged it themselves, and they've changed the way they teach these things and so on. And I think they're very conscious of it and so forth historically. But at the same time, there's this kind of like, I mean, all other Western states. I mean, let's again, Germany is sort of the extreme end of it, but France isn't that much better in terms of its repression of Palestine. The Brits are a little bit further behind,
You mean
and so
today?
on. Yeah, I'm talking about, yes, of course, today. I'm talking about today. So, in other words, the German repression of Palestinian rights, it lines up in that sense with what's going on in France and Britain and and other, not all but many other European countries, and of course the U.S. as well. Except that it has this added sort of, in Germany, it has this added kind of inflection because of the Holocaust and because of German guilt over the Holocaust. So there's that, but I think also the pattern, like the videos, the clips that were just up on the screen a few minutes ago, showing the protests at the suspension of this conference, showing the protest at the arrest of Ghassan Abu Sitta when he came to the airport, showing this incredibly vivid police presence, which we're now seeing on the screen. I mean, the state wouldn't need this kind of repression if there weren't also a very, very strong popular slash youth slash student movement in advocating Palestinian rights. So I suspect that what we're seeing in Germany in that sense is again similar to what we're seeing in other countries, where there's an increasing generational split between younger people and I don't know if we should yet call ourselves older people, but I mean, I guess in generational terms we are over this kind of question. And I think we see, therefore, the state repression is this sort of last ditch attempt to kind of make a popular sense of affiliation with the Palestinian struggle and recognition and identification with the Palestinian cause. Again, you see the same thing here in the U.S. I think that what we see is just that's kind of a constant now across the entire Western world, which with peaks and troughs, or more or less. And Germany is one of the places where it's the atmosphere is more repressive than in the U.S. Partly because for all of the flaws of the United States, the principle of freedom of speech is one that is still very, very powerful here, which European countries don't legally have that principle in the way that we do here. For all of the faults of the U.S. regime and the U.S. government and so forth, there is at least that.
But what does it mean? I agree with you, Sadi, on 100%. But what does it mean? And Karim, maybe you can help us think through this thing. What does it mean to atone? To atone at the expense of someone else, to atone for the enormity of the crimes of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and persecution of Jews at the expense of Palestinians, where you basically say, and Karim, give us your perspective on this, where you're basically saying Palestinians cannot actually express their desire for freedom because that expression of freedom, of liberation, of equality, basically is going to be anti-Zionist. And we have said, the Germans are saying officially, you cannot be anti-Zionist. Right? Isn't that what they're saying? Essentially, they're saying you can't be Palestinian. Essentially, you're not allowed to be Palestinian. We don't recognize you as Palestinian. And if you dare speak as a Palestinian for Palestinian humanity, even for equality, for all peoples, Muslims, Christians, and Jews in Palestine, we will suppress you. I find it astonishing, honestly. Karim, I don't know. Is it that are we too academic on this, or what are your thoughts on this?
No. Well, I mean, we are academic, but I think these are very important questions. And I mean, I'm just tracking. Last week, interestingly, the International Court of Justice again is back on the agenda, and this time the Nicaraguans had brought a case against Germany for for facing charges for allegedly facilitating the commission of genocide against Palestinians in Gaza in coordination with its military and political ally Israel. So they're being prosecuted. The Germans had to go present last week and defend themselves against this. So there is a material side to this. In other words, there is accountability that is at least been put on the table. And so you have the Nicaraguans pushing against the Germans at the International Court of Justice. We saw the very dramatic South African case against the Israelis themselves at the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice. And the Namibians added to that, of course. The Namibians added to this. You have the the ICC, the International Criminal Court. Karim Khan is still sitting there waiting. I don't know what he's waiting for before he does anything. But there have been several. I think the Colombians and others have pushed to try to open the case at the ICC. So you have what I think is really interesting, which is this all these international legal venues that have been reopened. Having been moribund, they've reopened, And in this state, it's kind of global South countries. It's the South Americans, it's the Africans and others, not the Arabs, by that way, but the South Americans and the Africans who are pushing on behalf of the Palestinians, in a sense, to kind of reclaim, in a sense, these international legal venues as the place where accountability can take place. And I think this is really important. It may fail. It may fail. We may end up with who cares about international law? Who cares about the ICJ? I mean, all that stuff may fail, of course. But it's interesting that we've moved away from the Europeans using this to kind of hammer down everybody and put, this is ours, and we're above you, and we have the morality and the law, etc., and you guys don't, to something where the Germans, the Americans, the Europeans, the Israelis are having to defend themselves against these charges in the courts that in which the kind of the legal, moral, political arguments are very, very clear to the world. I mean, so I think this, to me that's very interesting.
But Karim, on this point, there's a segue here. Like you said, the Arab states are not. So let's just segue this discussion a little bit back to our part of the world. So the Arab states are not actually involved, as far as I can tell, in any of these procedures. So why is it South Africa? We talked about this earlier, I think. Why is it South Africa? Why Nicaragua? You just mentioned Nicaragua. Why Namibia? Said you mentioned in terms of the German sort of genocide in Africa. Why all these countries and not the Arab states? I mean, like, in other words, where do the Arab states fit into this extraordinary Western sort of hypocrisy, the overt nature of this Western racism?
I think there's a relatively easy answer to that and a more difficult one. I think, first of all, when we're talking about the Arab countries, we need to divide them. There are those that are actually at war. I mean, Lebanon is at war, for better or for worse. Lebanon is at war with Israelis, literally. I mean, not just
divided.
Lebanon as a country is at war with Israel. There's no recognition. Okay. There's an active war, and there's division inside Lebanon as to whether there should be or shouldn't be. But Lebanon is at war, and there are several countries. Yemen is at war. Iraq is divided, but it's kind of at war. Syria, for all of the internal repression, etc. So there are countries that are Syria is a different case, but certainly Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen. These countries, there are countries and there are entities that are fighting back, no matter who's instigating, no matter what's happening. There's actual war going on, and I think it's important to remember that. So it's not the Arabs, all of them, but the Arabs that are, let's say, the Abraham Accord Arabs, if you want to call them that. Well, I think we know why. I think it's very clear, and I think we're going to have a guest in a couple of weeks. We're going to go over this, I think, in detail. And because this requires, I think, we need to kind of really go into detail as to what's going on in the Arab world and the Gulf and other countries in terms of these reactions. But I think it's fairly obvious. The Arab countries, whether it's Egypt, whether it's the Gulf countries, whether it's a country like Morocco, these are countries that have politically aligned with the United States, and so therefore with everything that the U.S. wants to push, and they don't want to expend their cards on Palestine.
Karim, I would just add to that, to what you said. Of course, I agree with what you're saying. And I know you know this obviously too, but just in terms of nuance, it's important. It's not countries; these are governments, right? Because at a popular level, there's absolutely uniform support for Palestine and the Palestinians. It's at the level of these regimes, and it's interesting when you put your thumb on it when you said, if we look across the Arab world to find, where is the least support. If you look at the governments that have the least support for Palestine and the Palestinians, it is the most oppressive and repressive Arab regimes, which of course are the clients of the great democracy, the United States of America, right? So which I think is an interesting thing to factor in. If you look at that equation is, I think, very, very telling. The most repressive Arab regimes are the ones that are, systematically aligned with the United States and hence against the Palestinian cause.
Sorry, but you can also add to this the Palestinian Authority. I think we need to also recognize it's incredibly difficult to try to analyze and understand a claim of a people under genocide, let alone occupation, let alone all the rest of it, when the nominal government and the nominal state, such as it is not saying anything. I mean, the Palestinian state is not saying anything. The Palestinian Authority is not saying anything.
Because remember that the whole U.S.-led peace process, in quotations, of course, has always depended on Arab dictatorships and Arab despots, beginning with Sadat in Egypt and going all the way to the Abraham Accords. It's the same exact sort of policy: repress and crush popular dissent, repress and crush the idea of Palestinian freedom, try to ignore the Palestinians as much, marginalize the Palestinian question, marginalize the relationship of the Palestinian question to Arab identity and Islamic identity, and force Israel in its current form. That's the extraordinary part. It's not even Israel to say in your book, you talk about denialism. It's not Israel that's pretending to be this liberal state. It's Israel in its most nakedly vicious form to Palestinians, carrying out genocide, carrying out pogroms, the nation state law, all that liberal mask has been sort of just discarded. And the Arabs are being told, the Arab peoples are being told, tough luck. You have to accept Israel as it is. Even Karim, I just read, a non-Arab state, Indonesia, has just signed up to establish relations with Israel as a condition to entering some kind of international, economic organization.
Well, there's
something.
You saw previously what they did with what the U.S. negotiated with Sudan in order for it to try to establish relations with Israelis. We've seen Morocco. Morocco was given the Western Sahara. So each of these states, one by one, gets given something, and all of this on behalf of Israel. And as you're saying, I think what has changed, and this is what's interesting. And Sari, since you've written about this thing, it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say about it. I do think we have shifted away from the attempt, sort of the Oslo thing, the Oslo peace process, and the 1990s was all about trying to represent a certain liberal democratic Israel that finally wants to kind of come at peace, and the Arabs have now accepted it, etc. All this kind of thing. Now, and in the intervening years, when all that collapsed, when the facade of it collapsed, until we get to the genocide onwards, there's no pretense anymore. So we're not even pretending to have this. So neither are the liberal countries pretending to follow international law, nor are the Israelis themselves pretending to be liberal even in facade and in negotiation and in representation. So now we're at this brute force situation. And so how does that gel with your argument? Maybe you can just restate your book, kind of the main argument in your book that deals, especially, at least I think it does, with the kind of liberal sticking their hands in the head, or putting their heads in the sand.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. Although my book is really, it's more at the sort of cultural or popular level than at the level of state politics. But I think you're right. There was that moment in the 90s where the pretense of the so-called peace process, the Oslo process, and we don't know necessarily how cynical these people actually were, because we all know that while they were talking about peace, they were, Israel was, continued to colonize and repress and destroy and demolish and everything else. And I would assume that the Americans, in fact, by the way, this is eventually going to get us to U.S. foreign policy, because that's what's lurking behind all of this kind of malice generally. But it's interesting that, if you remember when Obama was president, he very early on in his presidency, he had this campaign to kind of, again, yet one more attempt to resuscitate the peace process and so forth. And then he sent Biden. Do you remember Biden's first trip to the Middle East as vice president? So he sent Biden, and literally the Israelis, was it Netanyahu at the time? I don't remember who was in charge then. But anyway, Biden.
No, it was the Gaza war.
No, this was 2000.
He came in at the beginning of the 2008-9 Gaza war.
The Gaza, you're right. Okay, well then it was shortly, maybe it was shortly after the Gaza war. But anyway, it was the first time he sent Biden as vice president to oversee the resumption of the peace process. So it must have been, you're right, in the wake of the Gaza war, so 2009 at some point. Biden shows up, and literally as his plane is landing,
they just did it with Blinken. They did it last week with Blinken. Blinken showed up and they announced.
No, I know exactly, right. So it's like, which is like, all these things just show, and this is eventually we have to get to this question, but they show, is the dog wagging the tail, or the tail wagging the dog, which is a question we, eventually we're going to get to that, especially when it comes to the question of Iran and the Iranian response and so on. I know we'll get to that, but sorry, just to wrap up this particular point. Yeah, there was a moment when there was talk about a Palestinian state. And then, as you've said, then there's the Abraham Accords, which is premised on the silencing and disappearance of the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause. And remember the brilliant Jake Sullivan, like October 6th or something like that, saying Palestine is forgotten. Nobody talks about Palestine anymore. And then, of course, the next day something happens. So there's that. But, I wanted to ask, before we get back to American foreign policy, given what we just said, what do you guys make of this recent, really bizarre resurrection of the peace process and the discourse, very loose, because all it is discourse, it's all ephemeral, of a Palestinian state, like Cameron in Britain bringing up, we need to recognize like there's nothing. There's this, if not a rush to, even Blinken I think has said something like that, right? What do you think? What is that? That's a really weird. If Oslo, is it like first time is tragedy, second time is farce? What do you make of this resurrection of the discourse, the Western resurrection of the discourse of a Palestinian state, by which of course they mean no such thing? Because there will be, if the West has its way, there will be certainly no such thing as an actual Palestinian state. But what do you guys make of of this resurrection, the return of the so-called Palestinian state in the hands of people like David Cameron and Anthony Blinken and people?
I personally, I think that some of the Europeans are honestly still think that that's the way to go. I think the Europeans and some of the liberals and some of the UN people still think that that's the way to do it. So Spain and others are getting ready. I mean, so we hear to announce that they're going to support a Palestinian state. It's making its way into the UN again, and possibly at the Security Council, where the recognition of a Palestinian state may take place at some point. Another vote, if you remember, the US had vetoed in a previous iteration a decade ago. So this attempt to resuscitate it, I think they're taking it seriously at that level. Not the Americans, but some of the Europeans take it seriously as the only venue in order to resuscitate and say we need to bring some kind of stability. We need to put some kind of end to this Israeli expansionist project, which they understand is there now. And this is the way to do it. Now, what that state looks like, what the details are, what sovereignty actually is or isn't, how you negotiate, whether it's demilitarized, whether there's water, whether there's air, whether any of this kind of stuff, those details they don't really care about. But simply the political idea of saying we need to recognize a Palestinian state in order to stop what they will see as the extremism among the Israelis. Because they're still not understanding the core issue, which is that this is not about Netanyahu. This is not about a particular Israeli government. This is about the core of Zionism and the core of the Israeli project, which will not allow an actual viable Palestinian state, let alone a just solution to the Palestinian question, which involves self-determination, which involves the right of return of refugees and people living in dignity throughout the lands, no matter where they are. So these are I think it's a set of politics that the Europeans and some of the UN people genuinely think is the only way to at least go down a path that at least goes on a different course than the genocide and this kind of American insanity. I believe that. I think the Americans are much more cynical about this.
Karim, do you think that they actually mean, I mean, God knows what these people actually mean, but do you think, I mean, how could any country looking at the map of the West Bank, for example, think you can create a state there? I mean, like, is it just
it's the idea? What? It's the idea of it.
It's also, if I can say, it's also it's not just the idea of it. It's not just talk, it is talk, and it's just distraction. The most obvious thing, it's clearly just distraction. It's like throwing sort of sand in people's face, basically, to distract them from the reality of what's going on. It's also the dead end of their own, Karim. I think if you asked the Europeans, if you asked people in Europe, I don't think they would object to a Palestinian state in the West Bank that was contiguous, for example. I don't think they had any, nor would the Americans
at one
level really care.
That's what I'm saying.
It was an actual. That's what I'm saying. Of course, at one level, they would ideally love that at some level, but of course, everyone understands that you can't give this, as you said, Karim. It's built into colonial Zionism in Palestine. It's a settler project. It's going to continue expanding in the West Bank. It's being enabled in its expansion in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem. They're still taking over now East Jerusalem. They just want to avoid dealing with the actual questions, just like the Germans. We talked about this in the beginning. The Germans keep pretending to atone for
No, I
the
think it's
horrors
different.
of
I
Nazi
see it differently.
German. Well, let me finish. If I can just finish. All right, let me just finish, and then you tell me if I'm wrong or not. But in the sense of saying that the Germans claim to be like they're so invested in a particular kind of discourse about sort of atoning for the Holocaust, not seeing the Palestinians, just pretending that the Palestinians simply don't matter and don't exist and are not part of this equation, no matter what actually happens to the Palestinians on the ground. Same thing with the two-state solution, the so-called discourse of the two-state, which is to say they're so invested in this two-state language because there's nothing else. Because otherwise, what is it? Otherwise, you're saying perpetual subjugation, which they can't really say, or a one state, like a secular democratic state, which is exactly, of course, what's the logical, I mean, in theory, would be the logical sort of end point, right? The end of colonial Zionism and the recreation, just like the Jim Crow South was ended, just like apartheid South Africa was ended. That doesn't mean the end of people. It means the end of a political system and structure that is extraordinarily racist and discriminatory. That has to end, and they refuse to take that. They refuse to actually even contemplate that because that would shift everything. I think that's the denialism. In other words, is so apparent to me. Distraction and denialism.
It's not a question of
Maybe
wrong.
I'm
I think
wrong.
you're conflating a little bit. You're giving too much credit to politicians and diplomats who are not going to be thinking in deep structural racial, kind of analysis. That's not how they're just like, can we declare something? Can we do this? Can we get to an agreement? Can we do some mediation? Can we do some conflict resolution and stabilize this region, etc.?
Yes, exactly. But as a way, precisely. But my point is that they're stabilizing it, so-called stabilizing it as a way of deferring what everybody with half a brain who actually understands the history can see.
No. I think most of these Europeans would be perfectly happy to say, okay, let's just have. I mean, it's been recognized this business of the two-state, the 1967 borders. Gaza is maybe a separate thing, but at least the West Bank theoretically can say, okay, we just remove all the Israeli settlements, remove all the Israeli military things, remove everything like that, and create a corridor. So, it's.
Yeah, but Karim,
I'm not saying.
That's
saying
Karim, do you
I'm
think
trying to say in their
do you
minds.
think these
In their
guys?
minds. I'm not saying is
I
this
mean,
true or not. Okay.
no, I understand, but in their minds, if they've seen the maps of the West Bank, which I assume that they have, they think you can create a state there?
They're not looking at maps. They say in their minds it's going to be like, let's just create the idea of this. Let's just recognize it, and then the details will follow. For them, it's not so much that the putting of the Palestinian state. It's not so much to placate the Palestinians. It's to head off war. It's to head off an Israeli project which has gone off the rails, and they understand it now.
Who understands it, Karim?
So
You
it's
mean
not
the
so much.
European states understand it?
I'm saying the diplomats, the European states, these kind of things. They see that this is going in a direction which is bad at all levels, including instability, including the migration that's going to come their way, including the instability that's going to affect their interests, including this kind of endless support that they're committed to and are going to have to keep on giving the Israelis. It's a losing enterprise. For them to say, let's go back into let's say an easier world, a world of the past where we can just say two states and everybody lives side by side and everybody loves each other and everything will be fine. They want to go back into that. It's a fantasy, but it's something where they can. I think they want to put as a way simply to stop this particular genocide from happening and proposing a way that you can begin some kind of negotiation outwards. So you bring the Palestinian Authority people, you bring the Arabs, you bring the others and say, okay, let's sit down and start discussing. Basically, an Abraham Accords with the Palestinians.
Abraham plus one.
As
Abraham
opposed to the
plus
Abraham
one.
Accords. Abraham plus the Palestinians. Bring them in and have it. This is how they see it, and of course it's pie in the sky, but this is kind of how they see it. The Americans, I think, are much more cynical about this. This administration, anyway.
I think you're giving European diplomats way too much credit. You're giving them way too much credit, I think.
No, on the contrary, I'm not giving them any credit at all. I'm saying they don't have an idea of the big picture, and they don't have an idea of anything except very small, discrete things, which they still in their fantasy think that's their usefulness. The European usefulness is when the Americans say, okay, we'll go ahead with something, and then they can sit there and bring in, and let's bring these guys together, and let's go to the hotel rooms, and let's do this and let's do that. That's their role. That's been their role in the Middle East for the past several decades, right? Without that, the Europeans don't have a role. And the role becomes something where they have to deal with supporting the Israelis, dealing with internal problems. They have to deal with their internal domestic problems. They have to deal with what they consider to be this endless migration towards them, what they see as terrorism threats, what they see as security threats. That's the European obsession. They understand that the more the Israelis commit genocide, the more the Israelis kind of will create a regional war. If that happens, the more you're going to have problems that are going to come to European shores: security, migration, others. That's the only thing they care about.
Guys, just for the benefit of our viewers, I put up a map of the West Bank settlements so that people can see. And these are the maps I was talking about. If those Europeans diplomats have seen
Yeah,
this
well, they need
map,
to go there to see it,
you're not
or they
gonna
need to
see it
get
there.
the OCHA. Well, you need
Well,
to
there's the
the
map.
UN OCHA people when they go. I know this, and we both know people at UN OCHA when these people go to there and they sit there and they do their briefings and they show them the map, then they get convinced. I'm not sure a lot of those guys sitting in Brussels and others are sitting there looking at these maps. That's the problem, or the ones making decisions.
I think you guys are giving way too much credit to the European. I think it's cynical on both the US and the European end. As you said, Kerim, I think you're right. The Europeans are like the smaller, junior, like collaborators and the partners in the dispossession of the Palestinians, in the sense that they will do these micro projects and do all these NGO stuff in the West Bank, and all, even though the EU is the largest
That's been
trade
their role.
partner, but the EU is the largest trade partner of Israel. They'll do all this stuff,
And
and they'll
security.
keep talking about a two-state solution and security. They'll keep talking about all this stuff as a way of avoiding dealing with the obvious sort of issues at hand, which is to say that this is a settler enterprise, and it's not going to end, there's not going to be a two-state thing. And Sadi, in terms of the U.S. politics, we're gonna have guests on soon, who will help us understand and delve into this whole question of U.S. policy. But I think it's even more cynical in the U.S. case, because in the U.S. case, it's very clearly it's the U.S. of course is right now. I mean, we should maybe segue, because we're running out of time, but we should segue into the discussion about the U.S. politics. Getting the reading and Sadi, the reading. I mean, the U.S. response, for example, to the Israeli bombing of let alone the genocide, let alone the pogroms in the West Bank, let alone the killing of a U.S. aid worker, that Samantha Power, Kerim, you mentioned this, tweeted about or talked about.
Well, she didn't tweet about it. Somebody leaked it on
Oh,
Twitter.
somebody leaked it. Okay, somebody leaked it. But in other words, the U.S. Kerim, you want to tell us a little bit more about this? But also, just to get to the point I was trying to get to, which is to say, the entire U.S. posture vis-a-vis the bombing of the flagrant Israeli violation of international law, yet again, in bombing a foreign embassy. It's just, to me, it's extraordinary, the idea of a state bombing a foreign embassy, which when does it ever happen? I think the U.S. bombed the Chinese embassy at one point by accident or something in the Iraq War.
In Belgrade. In Belgrade.
Was it in Belgrade? I don't remember where it was. It was something, but they claimed
I'm pretty sure it was a mistake.
They claimed it was a mistake, but here the idea of actually bombing the embassy in Damascus, flagrant violation of international law, flagrant provocation, a flagrant attempt by the Israelis to drag the Americans into a larger war, right, Kerim and Sadi? And yet you see the American responses: we stand with Israel. We're going to protect Israel. We're going to defend Israel. We have your back. We're going to do this. How do you read that? I mean, beyond...
It's embarrassing. I have to say, if I were an American patriot, which I'm not, but if I were, it's embarrassing. It's completely embarrassing to have, and that's why I always think, when I think about those sort of tough guy America, American foreign policy, like, what's his name? The guy who looks like Captain Crunch, Bolton, like that kind of type, right? That they who want to be American supremacists, but they don't seem to understand that the United States is being led around like a puppy dog by this other entity. It's sort of amazing to me.
Is that what it is, Sadi? Is that what it is, or is it?
How can it be? How can this be in America's interest? How could a war with Iran be in America's interest, especially right now? It's inconceivable to me, right? And so that this entity goes and bombs an embassy in Damascus, and then America's reaction, okay, well, what are they? Urge restraint, but they don't even urge restraint.
bear in mind that there are channels between the U.S. and Iran right now. There's a channel going on between the Saudis and the Iranians. So there are all these channels that are going on, and the Israelis' main goal is to try to scupper all these, any. Of
To scupper all that. So
course,
how could that be in America's interests,
it's
right?
not.
How can that be? How can so
Which
this goes back to
America?
this
Which
longer argument,
America?
which we're not going to get. That's the but this it's partly that, but it's also the larger question of because there's and we've talked about this before. We're going to have other people soon on the show to talk about this in more detail. But this question of you know there's that one reading of Israel that says Israel is a colonial implant that serves that's it's like a tool of America. It's a projection of America in the Arab world, and this is sort of what people like Chomsky and even people like Chomsky say that that's what's going on. And then on the other hand, there's people who say no, American foreign policy in this region is dictated by domestic pressures, i.e., the lobby, right? Which is what Walton Mearsheimer, among other people, kind of say. So, to me, it's never made sense. I mean, the idea that this is somehow in America's interest is, as Karim is saying, like America wants they want to kind of to find some kind of rapprochement with Iran to kind of settle that issue. They don't want to have a World War III in the most sensitive part of the world.
Sadia, if I could ask, is this posture then the US posture? So to link it to our earlier discussion, isn't this basically, again, the masks falling in the sense of it's all about brute force? What the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, brute force. What the Germans are doing in terms of crushing dissent in Germany, brute force. What the Americans are now saying to Iran, if you dare retaliate for an outrageous attack on your embassy, brute force is going to be the response. Is that what we're talking about, or is it that all this U.S. threats to Iran are basically a way of trying to is it a way? Kenny, this is the question. Is it all these back channel discussions? Is this all a show to actually try to put pressure to
Saber
get some
rattling.
kind of saber rattling to get some kind of deal done on the ground, just so that Biden doesn't lose face vis-a-vis his pro-Israel electorate, and at the same time, I don't know. I mean, I'm just guessing at this point. I'm way out of my depth. Karim, I mean, and Sadi, you probably know this more than me. I'm wondering, like, how does one explain this extraordinary U.S. response, which on the one hand, for the last few weeks, has been going after Netanyahu and trying to personalize it and trying to make it all about Netanyahu as the problem. Of course, he is a problem and he is a catastrophe, but it's clearly a structural issue. It's not just about Netanyahu. But now pivoting from that suddenly now to saying whatever Iran does, we are going to back, which is again putting the U.S. back in a corner once more. And that's what I try to understand. Karim, how do you reconcile these two things? This business of, on the one hand, saying Netanyahu is the problem, on the other hand, saying we're going to back Israel no matter what Israel does.
No, I mean, I think, as I said, I think there's back channeling going on, and they're trying both directly and indirectly through various Arab governments and other governments to try to figure out what Iran is going to do, how it's going to retaliate, and to try to minimize that kind of reaction, because they also understand that Iran has an issue, just as Hezbollah in Lebanon at a certain point has an issue, which is that with every red line that the Israelis cross, and of course they've been doing it both in Lebanon vis-a-vis Hezbollah and now with Iran. Every time there's a red line, and that's what Israelis always do. Once they cross these red lines, then this question of deterrence becomes challenged. So if you hit an embassy and then there's no reaction to that, then you've allowed that red line. You've allowed then next time they hit an embassy, say, well, you didn't respond last time, so there's no deterrence to that. So I'm going to hit the embassy another time, and a third time, and a fourth time, and then that kind of thing breaks down. And same thing is happening in Lebanon.
Well, they've been bombing Syria. They've been bombing Syria now for
Syria
how
is
many
different.
years straight without
Syria is
any
different.
That's
It's precisely
no,
it's precisely
it proves your point.
Yeah.
It proves your
It's
point.
exactly it. Syria is Syria because the Syrians never bothered. The Syrians didn't have the means or the ability or the willingness to ever retaliate against Israelis, knowing that if they did, then the Israelis would destroy Damascus, and Syria has.
And so the result is the Israelis have bombed Syria
They
400
they go
whatever
in
times in the
and
past
they
2
do
years.
whatever they want, and they even attack sort of Iranian and Hezbollah convoys and things there, and that's part of that's part of what was allowed. That's why Syria, in a sense, is just sort of open in that way, but not the embassy. The embassy is a different line to the normal so-called, as they call them, rules of the game, where if there's a convoy coming in,
Why?
there's a whole tradition of international law and treaties that that means that an embassy is sovereignty. It's in this case, an Iranian embassy is Iranian territory. It's Iranian sovereignty. If you're hitting an embassy, that means it's the same as hitting Iranian territory itself. In addition to just the idea that if people are allowed to kind of go in or disrupt embassies and diplomats, then the kind of the fabric of this whole diplomacy and international law really falls apart very quickly. So it's sovereignty. So you're hitting sovereignty.
Not to mention the people who were in the embassy.
You're not hitting Iranian sort of convoys that are operating in Syria. You're hitting an Iranian sovereign entity, in a sense, in that consulate, in the embassy. So
no, but also the generals who were in the embassy.
But if you hit the generals in a base somewhere, they're just in a convoy going somewhere, that's one thing. If you're hitting them in an embassy, it's something else. There's a two different reaction.
You mean to tell me, Karim, if the Iranians had bombed a convoy of Israeli generals in Canada or the United States or somewhere else, that would have been okay under international law? I'm just curious. Or are you saying it just became a norm?
No, he's talking about the
rules of engagement. You're talking about rules of engagement.
Not rules of engagement, rules of the game.
It's just
the rules of the game. I apologize.
Call it what you want. It's the practice. Yeah. The practice has been that Syria was open. The Israelis would attack in Syria. The Syrians had absolutely no way to defend. The Syrian army, the Syrian armed forces, whatever people. And in any case, they don't have. Remember, they gave up the chemical weapons. So that was their only deterrence, was some stockpile of chemical weapons, which they were forced to give up. And they have no air defense, they have no missiles, they have nothing serious. So the Israelis can go in and do what they want at any point. So they hit convoys. But if you hit an embassy, it's a different thing. It's not. I mean, I don't know what your counter example was there, but that's a whole other issue. The whole point is that if the Iranians hit any Israelis anywhere, in embassies or out of embassies, it will mean that the U.S. and all the others will then say, "Oh, well, we have to retaliate. That this is unacceptable. It's terrorism."
Exactly.
Okay, so you get into that cycle.
Exactly.
So that's why there's all this back channeling taking place. Like, okay, where will the Iranians hit? They have to do something, otherwise their deterrence goes somewhere. And then the question is how, when, and what would the reaction be? And we don't know. Obviously, these are things that are going on, and God knows. I just want to, because we should wrap up. But I should just say here, just now, I just got, just a couple of hours ago, as we were coming on to record this, the first time in quite a few weeks, we received here in Lebanon, a security alert from the U.S. Embassy. Due to high tensions in the region, security environment remains complex and can change. We remind U.S. citizens of continued need for caution, etc. So there's this kind of caution. Review your personal security plans. Keep your cell phone charged in case of emergency. Exercise caution. So there's this sense of, and everybody here is going through the same thing. There's a sense that the Iranians are going to have to retaliate somewhere. And if they do, Lebanon is going to be involved in this. And if Lebanon is involved in this, then we may end up in some kind of very serious escalation and potential war. So all of this stuff.
Do you think this is I just put on the screen this Iranian seizure of an Israeli-linked ship in the Straits of. Do you think could that be the response?
It's possible. I mean,
do you think this?
No.
Or is there more to come?
That's a response. If that's a response, that's hardly a response in terms of the.
I don't know. I mean,
the question.
I don't think.
Karim,
no, just to end this thought. I mean, none of us are here to kind of to know how the Iranians are going to respond. I'm just saying, the feeling from Beirut is that something's going to happen, and that might drag everybody here into this kind of war, which is kind of, it goes up and down, up and down. As you know, there's a war going on in the south. There's an active war. People, if you're living in Beirut, it's practically like you don't even know that. People just get on with their business. But in the south, there's an actual real war going on. People are dying, and if there's a big Iranian response directly to the Israelis, then this is going to open up the possibility for the Israelis to kind of open. And I do think the Israelis want this kind of regional war, and they want to drag the Americans in, and they're quite happy to do that. And Netanyahu in particular is quite happy to do that.
So my question on this, could I just if I could just, I don't know, there seems to be a delay on my end, but if what I don't understand, Karim and Sadi, is that the what is the deterrent to the Israelis right now? So in 2006, Hezbollah had a deterrent in the sense that as the 34-day war of 2006 when Israel pulverized southern Lebanon and bombed every single bridge, every single gas station. If I remember correctly, they destroyed, they killed, they massacred. But in the end, Hezbollah had a deterrence that the Israelis were not anticipating with the missiles that ended up, going to Haifa and beyond Haifa. Do you remember that whole thing? What's to stop the Israelis now? In other words, if the Americans keep saying we're going to defend Israel, 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 what's just from an Israeli perspective? I'm wondering,
There's a massive
what's to
cost.
stop them?
Huge cost. There's a huge cost that would be.
What's the cost? I see the cost as they're provoking. Yeah, go ahead.
Let's put it this way: the first thing that the U.S. did after October 7 in this area was they put in an aircraft carrier into the Mediterranean. That was to deter Hezbollah. That was to deter Hezbollah because they understand that if there is a kind of war that's going to take place, it's not going to be just simply the Israelis attacking Lebanon and Lebanon being pulverized. I'm sure that will happen. I mean, that's what the Israelis are good at. They're good at using their aircraft and their drones to pulverize areas, as we see in Gaza and in other places. But the cost is also going to be that you can be sure Hezbollah and others have a plan for what's going to take place inside their areas. I mean, don't forget, this is the first time, just because of what's going on now in the south, you have between 100 and 150,000 Israeli settlers that are in their northern areas have been evacuated. They're not there. All those settlements are empty. This is the first time. Imagine that this is the first time. And same near Gaza, etc. So all these, but I'm talking about Lebanon. So you had this evacuation, and part of the clamor and the pressure is, and the reason the Americans keep sending their envoy to Lebanon, Amos Hochstein, who's an Israeli, he's the envoy who comes to Lebanon all the time to try to negotiate something like here. It's in part because you have all these Israelis that are putting pressure because they want to go back to their places and their settlements in the northern parts of their areas, right? So just that alone, and the psychology behind this, and the fact that they have to evacuate because they know that if there is a war that happens, there's going to be a lot of cost. It doesn't mean Lebanon won't be pulverized. It just means that they will have a lot of their country hit, and a lot of their economy that's already taken a huge hit now will take an even bigger hit. People will leave.
Yeah, but Karim, the question is, it's obvious to you, it's obvious to me, it's obvious to anybody who thinks.
Yeah, but it's irrational. But they are irrational. I think some of the Israelis are irrational. That's the fear.
Part of what's going on here is that this is an irrational state because it's never been told no. It's never had to pay a price. I mean, they attacked and crippled a U.S. Navy ship in 1967. The USS Liberty completely got away with it scot-free. They've never had to pay a price for anything they've ever done, really, right? So that makes them irrational.
No, there's a fight.
No, that's actually that's actually rational. That's not irrational because you're saying that they haven't paid a price. Therefore, it's rational.
No, but it means that no, but it's irrational in the sense that if part of rationality means you weigh costs and benefits and pros and cons and pluses and minuses, then that's that rational weighing is there, right? But you would think that they should be aware if we get into this thing. In other words, I think we all agree part of why the Israelis bombed the embassy in Damascus is to try to elicit an Iranian response, which would then be seized upon by the Israelis and the Americans to drag the US into this war, because the Israelis are not able to do what they want to accomplish. They're not able to accomplish what they've wanted to accomplish in Gaza. It's sort of like the US will come to the rescue in that sense. But so in that sense, it seems kind of clear that's what they're trying to angle for. But on the other hand, as Karim is saying, there would be a massive cost for them to pay too. And so do they not I don't understand. Like, do they not? I mean, if we can think this, surely their military strategists can also think this way. I don't. What do you think is going on?
I think there is a fight going on. I think there is a conflict going on between these kind of settler types who are not rational in that sense. I'm convinced they're not rational. They want to have this war. They want to, they're in this Armageddon kind of thing. They want to be able to have this regional war in order to kind of do what they need to do in the West Bank and other places as well. You have the deep state and the others that are more rational in their calculations. That I think I do think there is this conflict that's taking place between those that are trying to.
And then you have Netanyahu specifically.
But even within the rational calculations, there is a debate among the Israelis to say that they understand that eventually there's likely to be a war with Hezbollah sooner or later. I mean, here in Lebanon, they call it the Great War. It's going to happen. It's going to happen sooner or later. So I think if I remember correctly, on October 10th, the Israelis were going to preemptively attack Lebanon, and the Americans are the ones who stopped that from happening. So that, I mean, that's been leaked. So there is this notion that we need to, eventually there's going to be a war. We need to preempt and attack them when they are not able to respond, or when they're not ready for it.
Wait, who's they?
When Hezbollah is not ready for it. So the Israelis want to attack. There is an argument taking place. Do we preempt and take out, so that they don't do a bigger version of October 7th at some later date? Yeah, a kind of preemptive attack. This discussion is taking place. Even among the so-called rational kind of calculation people. But the settler type, these guys are irrational to the end, and that these are the dangerous people, because there's no rationality attached to them, as far as I can see.
I don't know. You guys keep talking about irrational and rational. I just, maybe that's the wrong terms. I mean, the settlers.
I mean, it's social science.
In
social scientific terms, meaning they're not taking their sense of what the costs and benefit are is a very particular thing. It's not done in that way. If I do this, I'm going to get attacked, so I don't do this and I don't do that.
But my point is that the settlers, the fanatical settlers who are carrying out pogroms even now, right? They're rampaging through the West Bank. They're rampaging through the West Bank in the 21st century. The question is that there's something rational in the sense of the calculation they've made is very clear, that this is an opportunity now to seize everything under the cover of war. And especially if there's a larger war with Iran, then we carry out all these other things that we want to do, that we've always wanted to do. That's their thinking.
The response to the rampages in the West Bank is this revival of the two-state thing. That's what the Europeans and even the Americans are using as the counter thing.
Or the sanctions.
And the sanctions, at least this discourse. At least the discourse. The discourse, even among the Americans, is that the rampaging in the West Bank has to stop. They're against that part, at least at the surface.
Well, the Americans have said that also. The Americans have also said that aid has to go into Gaza, and nothing has happened. So, like, what's the?
I'm saying these are.
I don't get it. I mean, I don't see
We have to parse these things out. The West Bank. The response to what the West Bank is going on is they're reviving this two-state solution. They're reviving this discussion of let's get the Palestinian Authority back on. They're reviving let's recognize the Palestinian state. Even the Americans of this fake business of put a sanction. I mean, it's just sending signals. That's at the West Bank level. At the Gaza level, it's different because the Americans and the Germans, let's leave them separately. The Americans and Israelis have in their mind made a calculation that if after all this time Hamas emerges intact, it creates a precedent and it creates a kind of deterrence which will make the 2006 war in Lebanon look like nothing in terms of deterrence, in terms of lessons learned. So for them, they need to have Hamas utterly destroyed and a kind of victory parade entered in by the Israelis. This is the danger.
Yeah, so in other words, you're saying the genocide in Gaza is going to continue indefinitely until Hamas is that what you're saying?
No.
We just read yesterday. I just read Benny Morris's horrific piece in the New York Times. You know, one of the most racist, explicitly racist Israeli historians, advocating for the destruction of Rafah. Right? Isn't that what he said? Go into Rafah and destroy Rafah, and let's be done with these people once and for all, essentially. And so, I don't
delusional. This is all this thing about Rafah.
To destroy Hamas. Sorry, Osama, but that was specifically destroy Hamas. That was the idea.
But the whole yes, but that's the Israeli discourse. It's always everything is to destroy Hamas. Everyone we're killing in Gaza is Hamas.
Okay, guys, I think we need to wrap it. We have guests coming up in the coming weeks that are going to flesh out some of these discussions. In the meantime, next time I speak to you, hopefully there won't be a big regional war. At least, from my vantage point, let's hope not, and let's hope things don't go badly. So,
and let's hope the genocide ends.
Let's hope the genocide ends.
Inshallah.
Take care, guys.
Bye.